Welcome everybody to today's webinar, Affordable Housing Countering Opposition. I am the facilitator today. My name is Tommy Burns. I'm an architect at Davis Square Architects in Somerville, Massachusetts in the greater Boston area. And I've been working in affordable housing for about 5 years now. Our first speaker today will be Amy Clark, who is the Senior Director of Marketing and Communications at the National Housing Conference, where she leads the NHC's strategic communications effort to elevate housing affordability as a first-tier issue on the national agenda. Our second presenter will be Ethan Handelman, who is the Vice President for Policy and Advocacy. Ethan directs the NHC's policy and advocacy agenda focused on advancing federal housing policy to assist low and moderate income people. Today's learning objectives will be: 1, to understand key causes of community opposition to affordable housing development, and learn to use frames as values-based messages to build support for affordable housing development, and learn about new or potential changes to federal housing policy and possible local impacts, at least to date. Understand key techniques and timeframes for effective nonpartisan federal housing policy advocacy. So today, Amy and Ethan will discuss the latest research and perspectives on the root causes of community opposition to affordable housing, and share how architects and others can use science-backed communications techniques to counter that opposition. They will also share the latest updates on federal housing policy and how participants can support effective affordable housing policy regardless of partisan affiliation. If you have any logistical questions during the webinar, you can submit them to the chat box, which should be on the right side of your screen. Any content-related questions will be answered during the Q&A towards the end, and we will get to any logistical issues as soon as possible. And today's webinar presentation is protected by the U.S. and international copyright laws. Reproduction, distribution, display, and use of the presentation without written permission of the speaker is prohibited. And if you can take a moment to look over the compliance statement on the next slide. And without further ado, I think we will actually reverse the order, and Ethan will speak first to discuss federal housing policy updates.
Great, thanks very much. Can you hear me okay?
Sounds good.
Excellent. So first off, this is Ethan Handelman. I'm the Vice President for Policy and Advocacy with the National Housing Conference. Big thank you to AIA for inviting me and Amy to speak to you all today. This is, what we do all the time, talk about federal housing policy and ways of communicating effectively about affordable housing, and it is always a treat to connect with new audiences. So we are happy to do it and are very glad to have the opportunity. So my section, I'll give you a very quick who the heck is the National Housing Conference, and then launch into federal housing policy to give you context, and then turn it over to Amy, who will do more talking than me, which is always a good idea. But for those of you not familiar with National Housing Conference, we have a funny name because we're really old. We've been around 86 years, and back in the 1930s when we were formed, a conference was an organization where people got together to do things as opposed to a time to get together and buy hotel rooms. What we do is educate decision makers and the public about housing policy and ways to advance affordable housing and move the field forward. We do that in policy work, which is what I lead. We do it in communications work, which is what Amy leads. We also do a good amount of research that some of our colleagues do here at NHC. all about trying to make sure that everyone has an opportunity to live in an affordable home in a thriving community. And there's lots of ways to get there. It's not particularly tied to any partisan agenda. We're a 501c3 nonprofit. We're just here to try and make good housing policy. That said, we're doing it in a context where federal funding has been mostly flat. That's what the graph you're looking at shows in a lot of ways. And what I've done is really try and simplify a bunch of budget lines and go back a number of years. So we're in different congressional environments, we're in different presidential administrations going back to 2011. The top line you see tenant-based rental assistance. That's the mobile voucher. That's the housing assistance that moves with people. It's not an entitlement. It only assists roughly 1 in 4 of the people who are eligible to get it. And the only reason that line is sloping upward at all is because rents go up every year. It's not because more people are being assisted. And in fact, in a lot of those years, fewer people are being assisted. You're losing vouchers at turnover, but the line slopes up ever so slightly just because of inflation in rents. Similarly, the next line, the light blue line for project-based rental assistance, we're not adding new units there. That's rental assistance that's attached to particular rental housing properties, and that just goes up because rents go up. Then you get to the red line. That's public housing. And there I've taken the liberty of combining their operating and capital funds. That's flat and declining. And keep in mind, this is on a portfolio of public housing that has at least $26 billion in deferred capital needs, a projected need that we don't know how we're going to meet. The green and the purple line and the gray line below it are the two block grant programs, CDBG, the Community Development Block Grant, and HOME. Those are declining and are likely to decline further. I'll talk about that in a second. And the green line is homeless programs, and that's trended up ever so slightly because we're actually making progress there, and it's a solution that has good bipartisan support, but it's very small compared to the budget overall. So this gives you a sense of, roughly where federal housing funding is. There's a whole lot of activity on the tax side, which doesn't show up here, primarily the low-income housing tax credit, which creates about 100,000 apartments every year, creates and preserves. But that's where most of the action is. The reason for that ties to how the federal budget is done. We start at the top with the total amount of spending the federal government does every year, and right now Congress is in the midst of figuring that out for the coming fiscal year. That's called a 302A allocation, if you want the technical term, but that's the budget cap, right? That gets split up into each of the areas mostly tied to one or more agencies that Congress funds through its appropriations subcommittee. So there's one for transportation, housing, and urban development, and some related agencies. It's primarily transportation and housing. Those are the two big chunks of it. That's called the 302B allocation. Once that's set, you get a chunk of it for HUD, right? So you're following the waterfall. After that, most of it is just math, because the primary thing that HUD does under Congress's direction is make sure that the people currently assisted with housing assistance stay assisted, because no member of Congress wants to go back to his or her district or his or her state and see headlines that people are being kicked out of their housing. So that's, depending on which year you look at, 80 to 85% of HUD's budget is renewing that assistance. Most of it is vouchers, public housing, the project-based rental assistance that I talked about. Little bit goes to the homeless programs and a few others, much smaller programs. Then the remaining 15-20% is everything else HUD does. And the two biggest pieces of that are the block grants, HOME and CDBG. Together they are, this year, a little under $4 billion. Next year, it looks like those are going to go down, and they'll keep going down because of this pressure to just keep renewing. That's why we've focused very much on advocacy during the budget making time, the appropriations period, on increasing that total amount of funding, increasing that 302A allocation so that there's more discretionary spending going on the domestic side, and then also having a larger 302B allocation for THUD, transportation and housing and urban development, because that's what really affects what flows through to all the individual deals that many of you work on, right? If you're doing plans and specs for a Section 8 rehab deal, or if you're working on a new tax credit property, or if you're working on home ownership developments, all of that depends, to the extent it depends on HUD funding, on those overall allocations. Because if the big top-line numbers don't go up, the individual program lines are all going to feel it. So that's where we have focused most of our advocacy. There are some other issues coming up, and I'll flag those for you and then give you some suggestions on how best to engage. One is the flood insurance program, the NFIP, National Flood Insurance Program. That has to be, at a minimum, extended by September 30th because its authorization expires. But there's also an opportunity to really reform it and deal with the fact that it is getting towards $26 billion in debt and mostly doesn't do a good job of sending good signals as to where we should build and where we should restore housing to get people and property out of harm's way. We're part of a coalition called Smarter Safer that's working on this. The bill that's been introduced in the House has some options for means-tested affordability help, which we have not seen in past reauthorizations, and could be a big step forward. So keep your eye on that. It's likely to be one of the bipartisan housing bills this Congress. Another issue is tax reform. I mentioned the low-income housing tax credit. That's a big issue for affordable housing. It's really unclear what the path for that will be. It depends a lot on how healthcare and some other congressional issues work out. It has the potential to really expand support for affordable housing, especially because there is a great bill right now to expand and improve the low-income housing tax credit. Senator Cantwell and Senator Hatch are the sponsors of that in the Senate. Representatives Teaberry and Neal are the sponsors of it in the House. There's also much risk to affordable housing because when you open up the tax code and start to talk about comprehensive reform, everything is potentially on the chopping block. The last thing to keep your eye on is housing finance reform, what to do with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. The Senate is working on that again. The course for it is very unclear. It might well not take up in earnest until next year, but it is still something to watch. As you're getting engaged on these issues, the slide I have up in front of you gives you a sense of the many voices there are in housing nationally. I took the list of 55 national organizations that are working with us in our Strong Voices for Affordable Housing effort and just did a word cloud to give you a sense of all the different types. You've got for-profit and nonprofit, public sector and private sector perspectives all over the map. And that can make it challenging for policymakers trying to figure out the best course. So as you're getting engaged, I would encourage you to take your cues from a national organization if you can, or a state level one if you have a good relationship there. Get some guidance as to what policy issues are moving, where your voice can make most of a difference, and keep in mind that a lot of times affordable housing is not necessarily split along party lines. Some of the budgetary stuff can be, doesn't always, but when it gets to how do we create affordable housing in someone's state, in someone's district, how do we make sure that the best policy options are available, that much more connects to local interests, and that's where your voice can be very effective. I know I'm bumping up against my short time, so I'm going to pause there. I'll let Amy take over, and then we will do Q&A at the end. I'm happy to get more specific on any of the policy issues. I know I touched on them very briefly, but we can go more in depth. So a big thanks to AIA again, and I will pass it back.
All right. Okay, here's my slide. Thank you, Ethan and Tommy. Again, I'm Amy Clark, Senior Director of Marketing and Communications at the National Housing Conference. And my role today is to talk with you a bit about some of the roots of community opposition, why people are opposed to affordable housing development in their own neighborhoods and communities, some of the reasons behind all of that, and what we can do about it in our communication. So number one, I will give a little bit of an overview of community concerns, which I'm sure all of you are pretty well versed in those, but I think it's helpful to have kind of the same starting point for the conversation. We'll talk about some of the reasons why opposition persists, even when we're able to counter people's arguments with our own points and proof. I'll talk a little bit about the influence of ideology, and then go into some of the things that we can do to build support and counter opposition. So in terms of the common community concerns, I think you can break them up into kind of three different types of concern. Number one, of course, we hear a lot about the characteristics of the housing, the developments themselves. So it's going to be too big. It's the wrong massing for the neighborhood. The design isn't right for the character of the neighborhood. It doesn't fit in. People will say that they don't think that affordable housing or rental housing or homes at all are the right use of a particular piece of land, and they want to see something else in their neighborhood. And we also see concerns expressed based on characteristics of the neighborhood and how those will be impacted potentially by affordable housing. Traffic, of course, is a huge concern. What's going to be the impact on parking? Is it going to extend my commute at all to have this in the neighborhood? People are really concerned about the schools in their communities. Is it going to change the quality of my child's education to have more students in a school or to have a certain kind of students in a school? And then people express concerns about things like noise and crowding. What's going to be the impact of just having more people in this neighborhood? And those two categories of concern, we can empathize with that. No one wants to have a longer commute. Everyone wants their kids' education to be the best possible. People like their neighborhoods. They like them the way they are. They don't want them to change, and they want buildings that fit in. And so we can empathize with that. But oftentimes, those concerns are, consciously or not, out there as sort of a cover for some of the other concerns that people have that really have to do with the people who live in affordable housing themselves and some of the stereotypes and perceptions around those folks. So class and racial bias, right? Whether it's conscious or not, that plays a huge role, or can. In this country, we also have some real biases and real entrenched ideas about the kind of people who own homes versus the kind of people who rent. And we see homeownership as conferring something important onto a person that renting doesn't. So there are concerns there. And then there are a lot of stereotypes and beliefs around people with lower incomes, around people with disabilities, around people with mental illness that really impact the way these potential new residents in the neighborhood are perceived. And there's a lot of sort of fear often around who these people are going to be and the impact they could have on the neighborhood. And I think as we consider these types of opposition, we have to really separate the stuff that we can deal with, things that we can respond to with changes in design or changes in the way the land is used or the development is used, and things that really are outside of that and are less reasonable, and we need to deal with those differently in the way that we communicate. So we usually have really good arguments, right, around those reasonable concerns. We can tell folks, don't worry, we've got that covered. Here's the solution to that. But community opposition, not in my backyard, NIMBY opposition will often persist. And there are a few reasons why that's the case. So the most important thing for you to take away from my presentation, if you take away nothing else, is that our minds are not blank slates. So when we take in new information, we filter it through everything we've already learned, media that we consume, experiences that we've had, the cultural models that we buy into, myths that have become trapped in our consciousness. And all of that stuff comes together to become frames, the lenses through which we view and receive new information. So everything comes to us through these frames, and those lenses really impact how we see things. So here's a little example of that. Take a look at this. See if you can figure out what it says. I'll give you a second. So you probably think that this says community development, but it doesn't. This is what was underneath that gray bar. So you can kind of see what your brain did here, right? You filled in the blanks. Based on your past experience, something that looks like this says community development, and you made that assumption. That's sort of a silly example, right? But this is a picture of the process that happens when people take in new information. So, just to give you an example again, Ethan knew when he put together his presentation that you already have bought into the idea of affordable housing, you care about it, you've come here with a certain kind of knowledge and understanding, and there's it's part of your work potentially. And so he could start out his presentation with that graph and just dig right into data. But because of these different frames that people have, because people are coming with different perspectives, things like confirmation bias can play in. We tend to interpret new evidence, new information, new data as confirmation of what we already believe. So Ethan knew that he could give you that graph and talk to you about budget numbers, and you weren't going to question it. But if you came with a different perspective, if you came with the perspective of we don't need affordable housing, we shouldn't have affordable housing, you would have looked at those flat lines and downward trends and said, great, we should have less, right? So we have a bias towards interpreting information the way we want to and towards the experiences and understandings that we already have. So when we put new information forward, when we present new ideas, when we're presenting a proposed affordable housing development, we have to be really cognizant that people are going to interpret that information the way they want to unless we set it up for them the way we want them to interpret it. Another concept that I think is really key in opposition is the concept of loss aversion, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with. So all of us, no matter what our perspective, tend to prefer avoiding losses over acquiring wins. So if people see a new affordable housing development proposal as causing them to lose something, they're going to be a lot more enthusiastic about stopping it than are the people who see it as a potential good, right? A lot more people are motivated to write negative reviews than positive. People call up their members of Congress to say no more often than they call up their members of Congress to say yes. So loss aversion plays a lot into the volume and visibility of the opposition that we see to affordable housing. So emotional needs. This isn't a huge aspect, but I think it's something that we need to think about and be cognizant of, particularly when people are coming to community meetings on affordable housing. Some of what we see in their communication with us has a lot to do with some of these needs. So, people who don't feel like they have a lot of power in other aspects of their lives, people who maybe feel like an entity larger than them, whether it's government or developers, when they feel like those folks have more power than they do, they may be reacting because of those things in their response to affordable housing development. So there's some of this that plays in as well. And then we see the persistence of myths. So the interesting thing about myths is that regardless of what a piece of information is, the more people hear it, the more familiar we are with it, the more likely we are to think it's true. So I could present a piece of information to you that was entirely false, but if I did it over and over again, it would stick in your brain and you would remember it and you would come to believe potentially that it's the truth. Another interesting thing about myths is that information that is untrue is more likely to be believed than information that's true if the untrue information, if the myth is simple. We like simple explanations, we like simple information, and we're likely to discount a complicated explanation of something if we have a choice between the two. And oftentimes myths are really simple, right? And then this kind of plays back into the idea of frames and of biases. But if a counter-argument goes against what we already believe, goes against our identity, goes against our worldview, then there's a backfire effect that can happen. So we tend to dig in even deeper to ideas that we have, into myths that we hold, if they're countered by an argument that goes against what we already believe. So now I want to talk a little bit about ideology and spatial beliefs, because I think this is something that doesn't come up as much in the conversation around community opposition, but these beliefs are incredibly influential in how we perceive affordable housing development and other sorts of changes in our communities. So liberty ideology, whether you're familiar with the term or not, I think is a concept that you're probably pretty familiar with. So it breaks down into positive liberty and negative liberty. So positive liberty is sort of the idea that the government makes freedom possible for you. Government gives you the liberty to do something. Negative liberty is the idea that it's government that government is what we need to be protected from, right? Government intervention is more of a negative, and we want to be free from it. And people tend to kind of believe along a spectrum of this, but these are sort of the poles of liberty ideology. And then there's spatial beliefs. You may have seen this in terms of the sort of right to the city framework, but spatial beliefs are about who can or should live in a community, who can use a space, particularly public space, who is allowed to participate in decision making. And we see a lot of this play out in neighborhood conversations. So, can renters serve on the neighborhood council? Should we put benches into our public parks that have armrests every 1.5 feet so that people can't lie down on them and sleep? Or should they be free for any use, even if it's a use that someone who doesn't have a home might want to make of them? Those kinds of questions also sort of form a strong belief system for people and can exist along a spectrum of beliefs. So there is some research done into homeowner opposition to affordable housing, scattered site affordable housing, and the study was really done of this kind of persistent opposition that existed even after it was proved that really, no significant negative impacts were experienced from this scattered site housing. And the research found that there was really sort of a cluster of beliefs that you could identify in people who supported affordable housing and did not sort of persist in that community opposition. So supporters were less likely to fear bad impacts on their neighborhoods, right? They weren't as bought into the idea that affordable housing was going to be bad for them. They understood structural and systemic factors that influence sort of poverty and other issues, and they supported government intervention, so they were on that kind of positive liberty spectrum. And they also thought that low-income residents had equal spatial rights. So they thought that people had just as much of a right to live in that neighborhood no matter what their income was, and that people didn't have to earn their way to live there. So that was sort of the cluster of belief that was found in supporters of affordable housing, and the opposition was, on the other side. So it's important to identify who our supporters are, and we'll get into more of that soon. All right. So I've told you about all of the negatives, all of the reasons why people might oppose affordable housing. So let's talk about some of the things that we can actually do to turn the tide. I have three main approaches for you. Number one, framing arguments effectively, so that we give people sort of the right filters through which to see the information that we're going to present to them. Two, we want to communicate strategically. We want to talk to the right people who are going to help us accomplish what we need to do. And then we want to be able to debunk myths. We don't want to drive them deeper into people's consciousness. We want to debunk them. So framing. It's really common in advocacy, and it's common for those of us who are experts in a certain subject area to put our solution forward right away, or to just go right in and say, you must agree with me that this is a terrible problem. Isn't this a terrible problem? This is what we're going to do about it. Instead of sort of putting the cart before the horse in that way, we need to talk about values, right? So what's the point of all of this? Why should people care about affordable housing? Are we bringing opportunity to our community? Are we rebuilding after a time of economic distress? What's the value or values that are really behind the affordable housing work that we're trying to do? And then we want to emphasize solutions. So instead of going on about how deep the need is, or how desperately people need these affordable homes as much as they do, we need to be able to paint a picture for folks of what the solution is going to look like. What's our community going to look like when there's an affordable home here or an affordable development here instead of an empty lot, right? What's the future going to look like? And then we need to be able to tell stories that share how affordable housing will help the entire community. So instead of just focusing on an individual family or a few prospective residents of a development, we have to be able to talk about the whole system, right? Because we looked at those supporters, the cluster of beliefs that indicate support, and those are folks who understand structural issues. They understand that there are systems, and they understand that the government can have a role to play, right? So we want to talk about those systems and structures, and why the economy is the way it is, and why the housing market is the way it is, and why affordable housing is out of reach for people in our communities unless we do this work. Because that will explain why it is that we're doing the work that we're doing, and it's going to capture those people who are already primed to support the work that we do. Then we want to communicate strategically. We can't expect that we're going to be able to win everyone over, right? And we don't have the time or the resources or the ability to really do that. So we need to figure out who those potential supporters are and really target them. So, listen for those people who are part of that cluster of beliefs, who believe that everyone has the right to live in whatever community they choose, and who understand systemic issues. We want to understand what they care about, right? If we're running into a lot of people who care a lot about education, then we want to talk with them about the positive impact that more affordable housing is going to have on education in our communities, and so forth. So understand what our audiences care about and really be able to target those concerns and those cares with our messaging. And then finally, it's not enough for people to just be educated about an issue or to be sort of bought in. We need to give them a way to take action. So what do you need people to do? Do you need people to come to that city council meeting and voice their support? Do you need them to sign a petition? Figure out what it is that people can do with that new passion and new support that you've inspired in them, and give them that easy way to take action. Finally, we want to bust myths. Fortunately, a ton of work has been done really by the environmental community in researching and figuring out some techniques for doing this, and there's a ton we can learn from them here. Number one, we want to emphasize facts, not myths, right? Because the more you repeat a myth, the more you're going to drive it into people's consciousness. Throw away that frequently asked questions that restates the myth, and instead emphasize what the truth is, right? Tell the truth. Your first statement should be something that's real and true. In order to debunk a myth, you need to share what the myth is, but signpost it. Preface it with an explicit warning. There's a harmful rumor out there that X, Y, Z. Make sure that people understand that what they're about to hear is wrong. And then give a clear, brief alternative explanation. No 15-point description of how something works, right? The simple explanation is what people are likely to believe, so let's give people simple explanations. And then graphics are an important and easy way to help people understand the points that we're making and to reinforce what the truth is as opposed to what the myth is. So use graphics, use illustrations to display key facts whenever you're able to. So that's all from me right now. I look forward to taking your questions.
Thanks, Amy. That was great. Thank you, Ethan, for the updates on policy. I wanted to start with a question. I'm curious if you guys know about availability of affordable housing in cities versus suburban counties. I know in Massachusetts there's actually a requirement for all towns to provide a certain percentage of affordable housing, and almost all of them are well below, and we see a lot of affordable housing in the city. Do you know across the country if that's a similar trend everywhere?
So I'll take a stab at this one. This is Ethan. It's a great question, and there is a lot of variability in the availability of affordable housing. Massachusetts is unusual in having that what they call the 40B requirement, that there's a minimum amount. New Jersey has a different version of it, their fair share housing requirement, but most other places don't. The challenge we see nationally is not so much that we lack a total number of homes or apartments for all the people that need them. It's that there's a real mismatch between places where incomes are rising and there are lots of jobs, and the availability and affordability of housing in those places. So there are some parts of the country, often rural areas, but not exclusively, sometimes they're in urban areas, where the economy's declined a bit and they haven't bounced back from the recession as quickly, or maybe it's an area that's been struggling for a long time, or the plant closed, where housing's pretty cheap, but incomes are even lower. So there are affordable housing challenges, but in a different way than, say, Metro DC or Los Angeles or New York City or San Francisco, where you have higher incomes but real constraints on the supply of affordable housing. It's really about looking at the way the income and the cost of housing connect. We have a neat tool for doing that on the NHC website, which is nhc.org. It's called Paycheck to Paycheck. And what you can do each year when we do the study is look at a group of kind of representative professions for folks of low and moderate income, and see at more than 200 metro areas what they can afford to buy in terms of housing and what they could afford to rent in terms of housing. Each year we have a different theme, but there's some sort of typical professions we look at, and it's a way to help see that mismatch.
That's great, thank you. I was also curious if you know of any studies. A myth that I've often heard is that property values will go down around affordable housing developments. Do you know of any studies that have debunked or even looked closely at that issue?
There are a few. I believe the National Housing Conference did one several years back, and I believe that CSH, the Corporation for Supportive Housing, did something similar more recently. We can actually do a little bit of digging and provide links for folks if that's of interest. And I would say, that information is incredibly important to provide because I think for the most part we see that property values aren't impacted or significantly impacted in a negative way by affordable housing development, but we need to communicate in a way that gets folks sort of more bought into our perspective before we hit them with that data. So that data is a great supporting point if we can have it for our communities, but it's probably also not the first thing that you roll out with. But again, we can find some links, I think.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. I like it was interesting the idea of landscape stories and how affordable housing can help the whole community. Do you have any examples that you see are typically cited?
Sure, that's a good question. The one that I often go to, it was a number of years ago now, but the New York Times did an incredible profile of a girl and her family in New York City who they had been living in a homeless shelter, and it was a story of really this family's entire life and the life of their neighborhood. So you got an understanding of the sort of economic forces that had made it difficult for this little girl's mother to maintain steady employment. You got an understanding of the housing market. You got an understanding of the services that the city and to an extent the federal government could have provided, but you also saw that there was a tremendous shortage. And you saw the impact that homelessness and just the sort of instability in this little girl's life on her ability to stay in school, on her ability to do activities that would help her succeed in her life. She was a dancer, and she had joined a dance troupe, but her life was too unstable for her to keep participating in it, and so she didn't have that activity, and she didn't have the support from that group. And so you really got a picture of everything going on in their whole life, and it made it relatable to the average person, right, who also has a kid in activities and also has a kid who struggled with one or another thing, and you could sort of you could understand it from that perspective.
I can give you another example, not as comprehensive as the excellent one Amy offered, but it's either from today or yesterday's Washington Post about the flood insurance program, and it gives an example of a moderate to low-income couple owns a house in a flood-prone area. It's flooded multiple times. They can't sell because it's in this flood-prone area, and it's hard to attract any buyers. So they tend to keep rebuilding and being ready to run when the floodwaters rise. And it looks at the challenges around the insurance program, but also how it impacts their individual lives and the pickle they have themselves in, given the very few options available. So there are frequently good examples in the media of these issues coming forward.
That's great. I'm curious, how is the NHC funded?
So we're a membership organization. We're funded as a nonprofit through the membership dues from organizations that join. We have an annual fundraiser every year here in DC, and that raises a certain amount of money. And we also get some foundation grants to work on particular policy issues.
Great. The Ethan, the graph you showed went back to 2011. I've seen some graphs in the past that have gone back to the 70s, and you see a really dramatic drop. Do you have any idea how much affordable housing federal funding has dropped since the 70s?
So it's interesting. You do see a remarkable drop. When you're going back that far, you have to really get into adjusting for inflation. You want to do graphs in real terms. I did mine in nominal terms for simplicity's purpose because it was only a handful of recent years. You also bump into real changes in how funding has been done since the 70s. So like in 1986, we changed the tax treatment of affordable housing and created the low-income housing tax credit. In the 1980s, we stopped funding project-based Section 8 contracts up front and started going to annual appropriation. So there's all sorts of noise there. What you do see is there was a dramatic increase in spending in the 60s and into the 70s in federal spending for affordable housing, coming out of the Great Society, coming out of the recognition of need, but also the social unrest that was going on. And then you have a bunch of these assets built. You have this built environment, hundreds of thousands of apartments. And in some ways, a lot of the spending going forward has been to preserve and maintain those investments, even as we're creating new ones through spending on the tax side. At the same time, what was in the 70s a federal commitment to flexible block grant style spending through things like CDBG, the Community Development Block Grant Program, really has not had as much of a focus. The CDBG program is right now on a path to be have less federal funding than when it was created in the 1970s, and that's without adjusting for inflation. And I'll tell you, a dollar today does not go as far as a dollar in 1975. So, there has been an overall reduction. I couldn't quote you a figure off the top of my head, partly because of all those intervening changes in the way the federal budget works. But it has not been a consistent focus in the way it was in the 60s and the 70s.
I see a lot of, in Boston area, a lot of the affordable housing going back to the 70s, and it becomes very expensive to maintain them. I wonder what percentage of affordable housing is so old that it's becoming more expensive to maintain than if they were to build new. That's one issue I've seen coming up.
So that's a good question, and Amy, you're welcome to jump in here too. I will talk a little bit about the kind of the balance between preservation and new construction. Older housing, as it ages, can get a little more expensive to run over time, just like your old car takes more fixing than your new car. But there is a whole bunch of embedded value in an existing property that, even if you're going to do a really substantial rehabilitation, is often worth saving. Some of that is just the physical structure, all the energy and resources it took to get concrete and steel and wood and brick into the place where it is. But a bunch of it is the place, right? If you look in downtown Boston, for instance, there are properties there that you could not recreate now, that are in the center of downtown. I mean, there are properties that I've seen because I used to work there, where even if the bones of the property itself need a little work, if you're building new, you're going out to Worcester, you're going south towards Providence to build something new, but the jobs people are filling are going to be right downtown. So do we want them to have to commute an hour and a half, 2 hours? on the commuter rail. I mean, I did that. It ain't fun. So, there's real value in preservation there. I will say, functional obsolescence is a challenge where you deal with properties that were created way back when we were doing more single-room occupancy, right? They don't have kitchens. They don't have sometimes even individual bathrooms for the units, right? That takes some real retooling where you want to be, thinking about it, and that's a great challenge for architects to get into thinking about ways to reuse space. But really, I mean, we're big advocates of preservation, and there are a lot of folks in the affordable housing community working on it. In terms of cost effectiveness, it tends to be highly cost effective. And in fact, we did some great work on this a few years ago. You can still find some of the papers on our website, comparing the kind of cost of a 1 year, 1 unit basis, taking into account the long-term viability of the property, and preservation pays off. So given the great need, I would say we want to be thinking both about preservation and new construction, but avoid the sort of easy trap of, well, you can buy a trailer for $80,000. Why are we paying $200,000 a unit for rental housing? A lot of it is due to location and durability and thinking long-term rather than short-term. I don't know if Amy has thoughts on preservation as well.
Yeah, I'll just add to that by saying that you tend to see much stronger public support for preservation than you do for new development, which isn't, that's also not an argument against doing new development, but in general, there is a lot of public understanding of don't throw something away, fix it. And I think, if you're looking at that choice, it is a real positive. It's easy to communicate to the neighborhood that you're upgrading the inside and the outside. Maybe there's an expansion or something like that, but you're going to get a lot more support for that more easily. So I think there are advantages as well in terms of building community support and kind of marketing the work that you're doing when you are doing preservation.
That's a great point. And the other thing I'll add, building on that theme, is preservation provides an opportunity, especially for architects, to correct the sins of the past. We've all seen the older property, especially from the 60s or the 70s, where you go, why? And a lot of those reasons were things like cost containment or, fads in materials. But we have the opportunity when we're doing preservation to really help properties fit in with the neighborhoods where they are now, and often that have grown up around them, and bring more beauty and functionality to the space.
Sure, that's great. Yeah, we do a lot of preservation in my office, and there are some beautiful old buildings, and there are some that are not so beautiful that we try to fix up a little bit. But it's a good point that a lot of them are in downtown Boston, which is right near job opportunities, and it would be very hard. They could never purchase a property like that now. I was wondering if you know of any states or cities you can think of that have shown really a good example of matching the housing needs of their communities.
So there's some great examples there, and I'm sure Amy has a bunch too, where cities, counties, and states have stepped up to not only leverage federal resources, but put their own resources into affordable housing. I'll give you one example that is recent and also near and dear to my heart: the city of Denver. So this is a city level. This isn't even a county or a state. This is just a city. For those who've been following, Denver's seeing record rent increases year over year, far in excess of incomes, and really struggling with how to deal with both creating and preserving affordable housing in the city. The city levied an impact fee on new development and directed those resources, which is $15 million a year over, I believe, 10 years, into affordable housing, and they created a renewable resource. It's a revolving loan fund, and it has currently my favorite acronym in affordable housing, the Revolving Affordable Housing Loan Fund, also known as RALPH. which they're using to leverage tax credit investments from the federal government, some other affordable housing sources, but they're providing key gap financing. So, there are other places that have done inclusionary requirements tied to density bonuses. So if you're building, you have to build a certain amount of affordable housing within the new development you're creating, but if you build more, you can do more density, and it tends to pay for itself. It's a win for the community. It's a win for the developer because it creates more value on the land, and it's a win for the locality because they're not having to put up as much sort of cash resources into the deal. You see a lot of different ways to put support into affordable housing, and we saw even in the in the 2016 election, a whole lot of localities and states pass measures in one way or another in support of affordable housing, even in an election that in other ways seem to focus on other issues. So it's locally very powerful, and the places that are making investments are doing so successfully. I don't know, Amy, do you want to highlight any examples?
I don't know if I want to highlight anything in particular, but I think what we saw as a trend overall, or what we're seeing right now as a trend, is that these high-cost cities where there is such a huge mismatch between what the sort of low and moderate wage workforce makes and the housing costs that exist in the communities, what we're seeing in these cities is that the general public understands that, the voting populace understands that, and they're supporting money for homeless shelters. They're supporting money for affordable housing development. They're buying into inclusionary zoning and to an inclusionary upzoning programs. So we've seen a lot of that support. The caveat is that doesn't necessarily translate to folks wanting that in their communities. Here in DC, we have a family homeless shelter that has been overdue for redevelopment or a change for a very long time, and basically everyone in the city understands that. So there was a plan put forward to put a new family homeless shelter, a small family homeless shelter in every ward in the city, and that plan is moving forward. But there was tremendous neighborhood level objection to having those shelters, a quarter mile away, a half a mile away from where people live. So even though there is great work happening in cities and in states and in counties, and voters are supporting things, people still don't necessarily want affordable housing in their neighborhoods. So there's a balance there, and you can't assume just because something polls well, or just because there was a lot of success on November 8th for housing trust funds and that sort of thing, that there won't still be difficulty at the neighborhood level when we're trying to build support for these developments. But again, there's a lot of tremendous work going on around the country.
We have a question coming in from the audience that asks about the kind of current appointment and the leadership at the federal level of HUD, and kind of how some of the comments can be either, are they an opportunity or more of a stumbling block for our work? And then kind of piggybacking on that, are you finding that a lot of the examples that you're giving right now are more localized, both city and state? So are you finding that there's a lot more activity at that level?
So I think there's activity in both places. The new leadership at HUD and USDA is still really taking shape. I mean, currently there is only one political appointee at HUD who's been approved, and that's the secretary. We've met him. He spoke at our policy symposium in June in our fundraising gala. He is new to housing, but seems to be open to ideas. So we're very much taking an approach of constructive engagement. We wrote, for instance, a set of comments to HUD on ways that they can improve and streamline their regulations in response to a request they did. USDA is going through a similar, in some ways more broad-reaching process. We're looking for ways to engage there as well. I would encourage folks to recognize that there is all this local activity, in part because the need is very localized, and frankly, a whole lot of housing policy happens at the local level. You know, federal funding is incredibly important, but it's only one piece of the puzzle, and so much more happens locally. But also to stay constructively engaged at the federal level and raise your voice, support affordable housing as a federal funding priority, but also, you know, urge the folks at HUD to do a good job being careful stewards of the resources they have and find ways to make positive change.
That's great. Thanks. Garrett, do you have any others to quickly get to from the audience?
There are a couple others. They're kind of very focused on stories that you can kind of use, you know, within specific areas like education. How can you show that, you know, more affordable housing helps with education? But I think we can get to those. We can make email introductions if necessary. But respecting everyone's time, it is 10 o'clock.
All right. Thank you very much, Amy and Ethan. That was a very interesting and informative talk.
Thank you guys for having us. I urge folks to check out nhc.org, which has a lot of resources on housing and education and other areas of policy, and certainly reach out to us.
All right. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. And please look over this last slide to complete the survey so that you will receive credits. If you have any comments or questions, you can submit them there, and we will send them to the presenters and hopefully get everything covered. Thanks again, guys.
And we'll put the recording on the Open Architecture Collaborative YouTube channel, as well as the presentations on SlideShare, and we'll make those available. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.